podcast. I'm Karen Weaver. Recently, the University of South Carolina has been embroiled in issues related to the roles, responsibilities, and the culture of their Board of Trustees. Things reached a fever pitch when a governance consulting team from AGB was brought in to analyze and then report on how the board could address and repair some of its issues. Let me use the reporting of our guest today, Lucas DePriel, tell the story in more detail. Lucas works for the state newspaper as a reporter covering higher education and graduated from Ohio University in 2015 with a degree in journalism. He wrote, as the Gamecocks football program headed toward what was ending up to be a 4-8 season, questions around the University of South Carolina coach Will Muschamp and his contract buyout, at the time that was about $19 million, were swirling. Several board members spoke to media outlets about the ability to pay such a buyout, as well as some other matters. In addition, reports citing anonymous sources also linked several board members to inviting former Gamecocks player Brad Edwards, who is the current athletic director at George Mason, to a game in Columbia to talk about a possible employment. And I might add, while the current athletics director is still working there. So when AGB presented their report, they took particular pains to chide the board over their inappropriate meddling in university affairs. I'll let Lucas tell us more about the board meeting as he was there and the subsequent dressing down that AGB directed towards board members who were overly involved in athletics. Welcome to the podcast, Lucas.
Dr. Weaver, thank you so much for having me.
So tell us a little bit about your observations. You're relatively new to this beat. You're not an athletics reporter, but obviously you've picked up some of the governance issues.
Absolutely. Yeah, the way I got started on this was in October 2018. Dr. Harris Pastides was the president of the University of South Carolina. He was very well liked down here. He had been in the position for then 10 years. By the time he eventually stepped down, it was about 11 years. So they started looking for someone to fill the position. So that's kind of where this whole situation started. And, 11 years, as your audience knows, is a pretty long time for a college president.
It is.
So everyone in town had kind of gotten used to him, whether it was the political figures, since we're the state capital, the legislature gets used to him because he's the one making budget requests. So everyone was used to Harris Pastides, who was a very personable, talkative kind of, he stopped to take selfies with students on campus. And Bob Caslin is a very different sort of figure where he's very focused. He's a little quieter, but I'm sorry, I'm getting a little off track here. Specific to the meeting itself, which is kind of where the story has the latest chapter that's unfolded. If you guys are going to hire AGB to look over your board procedures, I would expect a dressing down, because they were very, very hard on USC at first. I was really surprised. Sometimes people hire consultants to endorse their actions and say, this was all good. This wasn't really one of those cases. AGB really went after the board of trustees, their culture. They talked to board trustee members. They were very thorough. So they were pretty aggressive up front. The first half of the meeting, they really just laid into the board of trustees, told them a lot of hard stuff they didn't want to hear. And the second half of the meeting was a lot more productive in terms of them saying, okay, now that we've identified these problems, here's how we think you should fix it. And then they presented a bunch of different possible solutions.
So walk us through what the room was like when you got there. You knew when you attended the meeting this was going to be a discussion with AGB?
I did, yeah. The day before, I got a copy of the AGB report, and I was shocked at how directly it criticized the board. But maybe I shouldn't have been. I've never been in one of ththese scenarios, so people with more experience with AGB might know more. That is probably part of the reason that President Caslin was pushing for them, is I believe he had some experience with them at University of Central Florida when there was kind of a mess down there with their financials. I don't know all the details about that, but I know Caslin had worked with them, so that's one of the reasons he was pushing for AGB. I guess they were going to come down there, maybe tell them some hard truths, some hard things that they didn't want to hear. The room itself was pretty calm. The trustees got a little defensive, a little cagey on some stuff. But even AGB, I wrote his name down. I kept forgetting it, but Richard Legon, I think I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah,
You know,
he's the
sometimes he was
former
trying to.
president. He's the former president of the Association of Governing Boards, also known as AGB. Yes.
Yes. Okay. So he would even say stuff sometimes about like, you know, your culture's completely political, it's self-serving, and a board member would push back, and he would say, "Look, I was just trying to provoke you," which was it was an interesting dynamic, but I think he was trying to kind of shake them awake. Sometimes I've been in a lot of board trustees meetings. Nothing against USC or the board, but they can be really dry sometimes. There's not a lot
Yeah.
of times a lot of people are standing up and shaking the cages, and if they are, it's an executive session, and I honestly don't really know much about what happens there. So public meetings are very rarely is there a loud dispute. So I think it was just this, the tactic of AGB was to come in there, a little bit of shock and awe, and really force them out of their comfort zone so that they could start considering some different solutions.
I think that's a really helpful comment because I think you're absolutely right. In so many situations where trustees have to make difficult decisions, they do it in executive committee and they don't let the public see. And in this situation, they decided that they needed to open it up. Did you have any sense as to why it was in an open meeting?
That's a good question. That is something that I thought was just a USC thing, but apparently other schools, um, from your comments, seems like other schools have this condition. But I also covered the local school boards, and they really don't meet in executive session for very long. The
Right.
fireworks are in public. There's public disputes. There's disputes over votes. There's all kinds. It's the messy democracy you get to see in person. I get the sense that when I would go see University of South Carolina's Board of Trustees meeting, there wasn't a whole lot of deliberation. It was very clear in the public eye, and the executive session would be really long. Every once in a while, people would ask a couple questions, but you know, they seemed almost to be token questions. I'm not really sure what was talked about behind, because there's certain stuff you're not supposed to talk about in executive session. But if we don't know what you're talking about, how do we police that? And if
Right.
the people there aren't allowed to talk about it, then how does it get out? So um, as to why they did this in the public session, I don't know. I think USC has had so much. That's a great question, actually. I'm going to guess and say and in dealing with their communications department, I think they've had a lot of very public blowback from this. You know, the mayor of Columbia was involved. Um, Political candidates, like I think even Bernie Sanders said something about it. There's a lot of there's starting to be a lot of national attention on this for all the wrong reasons.
Right.
And I think USC, and like I said, from judging my interactions with their communications department, um, wanted to just be open about this and they just wanted to take it on the chin. They didn't want to try to duck any of these punches and then make another story about how they tried to hide something or they buried a report. Just, you know, and because like a lot of times I'll have, you know, people telling me like, hey, there's a meeting tomorrow and AGB is going to be there and this report's going to come in. It's, you know, so it seemed like they were pretty open about it, because I think they just were ready for this to be over.
Right. Right.
And
Well,
since the allegation that a lot of this stuff happened behind closed doors, I still don't know what Governor McMaster said to board of trustee members. No one else really does. Some people said he's like, hey, just you should vote for Caslin. And some people were like, you call the voter, I will. So depending on who tells you what that call was like, and that was all done in the dark. That was all done behind closed doors. I think USC just wants to take their last couple punches right on the nose and just move on from this.
and move on. Yeah, and you're alluding to the whole other fiasco that happened around the appointment of the president. Do you want to share that briefly with us?
That was really where things exploded when after Pastides had retired. There was about he retired in August or October rather, announced his retirement, and then in April, USC announced their finalists. They brought in 4 finalists. One of them was General Caslin. So when the trustees were going to name the finalists, there was a group of students who had heard from a media source that Caslin was considered to be a favorite. There was about 40 students who had protested that. Some of the faculty also disagreed because they didn't think that he was equipped for a research university because of his he didn't have a doctorate degree. Running West Point is very different than running a university like the University of South Carolina, where you have like 8 campuses and 51,000 students, and the enrollment situation. They're very different universities.
Right.
So there was a lot of people who had issues with that. Some people criticized his service in the Iraq and Afghanistan wars. You know, being a part of some wars they might have disagreed with, but it was pretty small compared to what came later.
Right.
In July, I had people telling me, and it was an open secret at the state house. Like I had state house reporters saying, "Hey, I'm hearing that Governor McMaster's calling the board of trustees and asking them to cast a vote." And I said, "I know, I've heard the same thing." Eventually, Charles Williams, one of the trustees, went on the record about it. We broke the story, and people were reacted very passionately. Most of the people who heard it, I'd say, either really, really liked that the governor got involved and got this done with, or were very angry that the governor got involved. Because the governor has never attended a board meeting since being the governor. He didn't even attend the vote for the meeting that he pushed for so badly. So this isn't. It was very abnormal for him to get involved. So some people were mad. So this is undue political influence. The SACs, the accrediting body, starts saying, well, is this because he's technically an ex officio member of the board? That's when things got really bad. That's when SACs got involved. That's when USC formed an AAUP chapter. The whole thing started. That's when things exploded. April was kind of quiet. There were some protests. There was a split board, some disagreements behind the scenes. And that was one of those situations where that entire board meeting in April was pretty much behind the scenes. They were doing final interviews with people, and then they came and took their vote, reopened it, and put in a guy, Brendan Kelly, who's now he's somewhere in Georgia. He's the president of a university there, who was universally liked by everybody. Everyone at the university, no one had anything bad to say about Brendan Kelly, and which that might be why they lost him. And I don't know, I've seen a lot of faculty speculate on that, but I apologize, I'm getting tangential. But July is when things really exploded. That's when SACs got involved. That's when AAUP started looking at this. That's when you really saw faculty get involved. That's when the political candidates, the mayor of Columbia, a lot of people got involved.
So there was a lot of politics involved in this, and certainly you're talking about the year 2019. So this was not all that long ago. But one of the things that struck me about some of your stories is that how the board is appointed, because you've referenced the governor a few times. Can you just talk briefly about that?
Sure. The majority of the board members are elected by the General Assembly. So there's a selection process. There's I don't know, they put basically the job opening out there, and people go to apply for it. You go to a subcommittee interviews, you ask you a few questions, and then if they think you're, it's almost like a bill where the members of the subcommittee take a vote on you. If you're worth moving on to the next spot, that's where you go. So, and then you get approved from there. And most of the time, board members get reapproved. It's kind of rare for an incumbent to get voted out. So that is how the lion's share of board members are elected. There's a couple ex officio. There's the superintendent of education. There's the governor, and there is the alumni association. And then the governor gets to appoint one person on the board to just as a general designee, and another person who is supposed to be voting in the governor's stead, which that seems to be what happened here. What's interesting is the oldest serving member of the board, Eddie Floyd, and I know we're opening something that's a little different. It's been there since 1982. USC's board, and this has been a major issue on this for a long time, is its very stark lack of diversity. Eddie Floyd said that when the governor first started doing that, started appointing another person to the board, without the General Assembly's process, the whole point of that was to help increase diversity. But, McMaster has appointed 3 white men in his positions. One was a temporary appointee to replace a board of trustee member who passed away. So, that's perhaps that was how it originally was. But, right now, the 2 guys he had appointed to the board are campaign donors.
Right. And that brings up a whole other set of complexities when your board doesn't really reflect either your state population or the population of the students that go to your campuses. So let's kind of refocus on what AGB then brought to the meeting after they got done kind of calling them out and then saying, okay, how can we fix this? They took some time to really point out some issues with trustees and athletics. Can you talk about those?
Yeah, with athletics, they pretty much said you're there to hire to get the president and athletic director kind of on the same page, and then stay out of it. There's a lot of board of trustee members who will talk to the press, which is interesting. It was interesting to see AGB say you're a board and you shouldn't go talk to the press or just go out and give your individual opinions, which that was very strange to me, because they are elected and they are public officials. Even though it's a volunteer position, they're still handling billions of dollars of public money in their term.
I think
So
that
that was
I was going to say, Lucas, I think that's a really important point, because I know that's sort of been standard operating procedure when it comes to board governance, that there's only one voice. It's usually the chair of the board who speaks. But you're right, they're managing millions of dollars of public money, and they are publicly elected officials. So that's something just for folks to think about. But go ahead.
yeah, that surprised me to hear them say that. There was also I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought.
But talking about the athletics and the report that they said stop talking to the local media.
Yeah, basically they said stay out of it, and talk and just bring up your opinions at the board, and whatever the board goes with, don't dissent. Or not don't dissent, but don't go out publicly and start stirring things up.
Right.
Now, if they had followed that all along, then we never would have heard about the governor getting involved in this situation. So, but also AGB says you shouldn't be taking those calls anyway.
Right.
If a politician calls you and says, "I'm sorry, sir or ma'am, we can't talk about this."
Right. Right.
They said, and the board was very conflicted on that. And they said you just need to have a policy and stick to it, because
Right.
everyone did have a different definition of what they were supposed to do when a politician calls them. Because some of them are like, because they are going to the legislature and asking for money. And if this hasn't happened that I know, but let's say the chair of like the budget committee gives them a call and says, "I want you to do this." You have to be taught, or you're asking for funding, and they say, "What do you think about this?" Like it is complicated, but the takeaway was that they needed to have a system of what to do when a politician talks to you and follow it, which
Yeah.
they did not have before.
And that's true for any board or any university. Usually, the president speaks on behalf of the institution, and not necessarily would they ask the head football coach to speak on behalf of the institution. They would ask the football coach to stay in his lane and talk about football. But let's dive down to a couple of the issues. So, in one situation, trustees, as trustees do, were upset with the fact that South Carolina was 4-8. They were having a lousy season. You have to deal with Clemson, who's sitting in your backyard having these great seasons. And that puts pressure on trustees to try to do something. And so it appears from the sources that you have found that they were actually trying to figure out how to buy out the football coach. And it doesn't sound like they were having conversations with the president about that. Is that your reporting?
I don't know. I know I know there was talk, at least among fans, certainly on Twitter, fans get frustrated. And I'm a Cleveland Browns fan, so I know what it's like to be in a fan base that just constantly loses, that is just a constant, so I've been there, you lose a game to the Bengals and everyone's like, fire everybody. So I saw a lot of talk about that. And, even though they beat Georgia, who was a really good team this year, they still lost to Appalachian State and UNC. So there's a lot of fans who are saying, is it time to give up on Muschamp? And a lot of our sports reporting had said, yeah, his buyout was, I think at the time, like $19 million. And one of the questions I had was, can we even afford that? So I was calling board of trustee members and I started asking, is this possible? Because as your entire audience knows, there's a ton of money in higher education, but that is pretty much not liquid. It is hard to find liquid money in a higher education budget because it's all going to teachers, capital reserves, classroom scholarships. There's guarantees. You can't just hack at someone's salary. You can't cut scholarships. And people would revolt if you did to pay for a new coach. So it's not as easy to find, even though you have like $1 billion budget, it's not easy to just come up with $19 million plus pay a new coach.
Right.
So, and some other trustees were saying, well, we could probably make it work if we moved a couple things around. And so that was pretty much what that story was about, is can we even afford this,
Right. And the question becomes, is it appropriate for the board members to be doing that in real time rather than letting the president do his or her job and bring that to the board attention after the internal university staff has executed its responsibilities? It's fundamentally inappropriate for a university trustee to insert themselves into the process before the process has even begun.
That was certainly AGB's position.
Yeah, yeah. Then we have this situation where it appears that several board members wanted to make a change in the athletic director chair and decided to invite a former football player at South Carolina, Brad Edwards, who is a sitting AD at George Mason. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
I know what report you're referring to. That is not something we've been able to corroborate.
Okay.
I don't. Yeah, honestly, I wish I had more to add on that, but I don't. I don't want to speculate.
Fair enough. Fair enough. So suffice it to say that AGB really had some particular comments about how the trustees were being allowed to have really too much of a role publicly and maybe behind the scenes in interfering in university affairs, and that the AGB likely said to them, you know, it's really best to let the university staff deal with most of these, and your job is to provide oversight. Did you get any sense after the meeting how folks responded to this new direction that the consultants were advising them to take?
I have not. It is something that's on the agenda because there is not like a concrete plan going forward. Like I imagine they're going to amend bylaws or put in certain protocols. Like, for example, like one way they said they could boost diversity would be to add non-voting trustees to the board. So, for instance, like they because it's in law, they can't just pick another trustee. Some colleges can do that. AGB liked that approach, but USC just isn't in that position. The legislature doesn't have an appetite for it. But what they could do is they could, for example, say like, okay, we have too few African Americans on the board. Let's have a representative from the NAACP sit on the board, or let's make sure let's double the amount of faculty on the board. That's stuff they can use to boost diversity that really isn't going to cost them a whole lot. That's the kind of stuff I'll be looking for when they actually roll out a plan. And it's something I'll follow up with in a little bit. But it is interesting to see what they do because you can have the consultants give you information for days, but the question is, are they going to do anything?
Right, right. And if I remember correctly, I think there's 19 total members of the board. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's about I think you count if you count the governor and his designee, I think there's 20.
Okay.
But yeah, it's about that.
Okay, so one choice might be just to enlarge the board and just make it a bigger and hopefully more diverse board.
It's interesting you mentioned that because there's a bill in the legislature that's getting a lot of traction that says to decrease the size of the board.
Yeah.
And AGB thinks that's the worst idea ever. Basically, right now we have it divided up by judicial districts. You run in your judicial district. The way the legislature wants it to be is through congressional district. Now that argument is to do so because the congressional districts rather, each year or whenever they redistrict, the population's balanced. That way you have one trustee representing 500,000 people or whatever that number is, instead of judicial districts where like Charleston's huge, Columbia's huge, but like Allendale's small.
Right.
It reduces the number of people on the board, and there's some skepticism, especially from AGB, about whether that would actually do anything. AGB thinks it would do nothing. It would make it worse. But that is something that's being kicked around the legislature that could pass.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a topic in other states as well. I've covered on this podcast a university that had 8 people on their board of trustees, which is sort of an unusual number because usually they're odd numbers and not even numbers when you're trying to look at voting. So, Lucas, I really appreciate you joining us to talk more about this particular issue because, quite frankly, if you follow some of the efforts that AGB has given to other campuses, not often does athletics come up, and that's why I thought it'd be interesting to talk with you about this particular situation.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think it came up here because it was a whole look at the board culture. It was almost like they're picking up the rock to find one thing, and they find 10 things, so they're going to put 10 things in the report. And there was a lot of stuff that played out in the press with, especially when Caslin first got here, talked to said some stuff that he probably thought was off the cuff to newspapers, and they reported on it. And he was like, I didn't quite say that. And then the newspapers released the audio, and it was the newspapers. That didn't happen in our case. That happened to some papers he met with before me. But that was probably part of it too, was this public talking a lot about athletics. And there was some like AGB was looking at this like, okay, this has obviously resulted in a lot of bad headlines. How do we fix this?
Right. Right, which is also a concern of trustees in terms of, state funding and how your public perceives you and those kinds of things. Well, Lucas, thank you so much for taking some time. I know you're hustling to do a million different things, but we really appreciate you spending some time with our listeners.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Weaver. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.